Our last speaker is David Kane. I have to admit that I didn't know what architecture rhythm and architecture beats are. And so I hope I find out by the end of the presentation. So I'll let you go.
Are we okay for sound here with this mic? All right. So to answer your question at the beginning, I will start off with what I mean by the rhythm of an architecture. So it's the recurring, predictable exchange of work products within an architecture group and across their customers and suppliers. And I really think about this as having three pieces, right? The tempo, the pace at which things are happening, the content, what is being exchanged amongst the various participants within the architecture ecosystem, and the quality, how good is the stuff that is being exchanged amongst those groups. Within any kind of ecosystem, we'll have lots of different kinds of beats going on. So we might have if we have agile software development teams, we might have some kind of weekly or bi-weekly pulse of the development teams. We might have some pace by which we're trying to get milestones or particular releases out. And these might cut across organizations in different kinds of ways. We can also envision what it might look like to have sort of rhythm being off by one reason or another. So in this top left-hand corner, we have sort of a group that's got some beat going on, but they're just not delivering anything, right? There's no content there. The one on the bottom, we've got stuff going on with quality and content, but maybe the pacing with which they're releasing stuff might be just inconsistent. The one on the right, I see in a lot of organizations where they nominally have a regular cadence of things, but the only way they're achieving that regular cadence is that they're taking various kinds of shortcuts, which has an impact on quality. Now, I don't really think this notion of rhythm in the context of architecture is new. I think you can see this idea showing up on a lot of places. I mean, I wrote some stuff around this in the late 1990s. I can see this reflected in things like the Scaled Agile framework and even some of the Agile methods themselves. But there are a couple things that have made me think about this topic again, and I want to share both some of this sort of longer term thinking I've been thinking about in terms of architecture and some newer things I've seen sort of in the Agile and Lean space and tying this back together. So why is architecture valuable for organizations? Well, I think the first thing is that it aids transition management, right? If you don't have a kind of rhythm, then every kind of exchange between participants becomes a new thing that requires explicit communication and coordination. I just think about, say, the mechanics of this conference, right? We know roughly that this conference is going to happen again next year. I suspect some of you in the audience may already be thinking about what topic you're going to present next year or pitch. And so even though there's been no formal announcement of the call for papers, we sort of know that that's going to happen. When the actual call for paper happens, we may be ready for that and can respond. And so because it has this particular pace, right? So when the cadence is there, we can anticipate things and have less kind of explicit coordination. Another thing that having a rhythm does is it drives closure within organizations, right? So coming back to our conference example, I'm reasonably certain, speaking for the various speakers that are here, we probably got a whole lot more done on our talks in the last month or so than we did in the first month after our talks were accepted, right? Whether it's a formal deadline, like where we have a high cost delay of not being ready to give our talk, or whether you're thinking about just something that's been taking too long, you need to get a move on. The fact that we have this regular expectation that we're going to have to deliver something creates more opportunities within the organization to drive closure and get things out in a valuable way. One of the things, though, that having this kind of repetition creates is an opportunity to build trust. If you there's a particular group that I've worked with that historically had made promises and commitments about major things that other parts within this architecture ecosystem was going to be counting on, and then not delivering on it. And that caused mistrust that really built up over years. And the way that that group has been able to rebuild the trust within those other organizations is in fact getting to a pattern of being able to release and do so on a regular cadence. So having a good rhythm means we have more opportunities to make our commitments, and therefore by making our commitments are able to build up trust. This thought was brought home to me recently, a talk that I saw from Jeff Nielsen in Agile DC last year about a common pattern that you see within Agile teams, and I think it's also relevant at sort of the scale when we think about it in terms of architecture. I'll try to do the disservice of turning his 45-minute talk into one slide, but so he had this velocity chart of the patterns of a particular Agile team, and asked people in the audience, well, how much work should this team commit to? And most of the folks in the audience said somewhere like around 21 points of work, because that was about the mean of what the team had done since they had started up. And it's a fairly common pattern, right? On average, you've done this much work in the past, so therefore that average is what we should commit to going forward. And he said, well, no, maybe we should commit to 19. And his logic was, half the time that particular team was over 21 and half the time the team was under 21, which means about half the time the team was not going to be able to make their commitment. Whereas if you committed at 19 points, the 9 out of the 10 previous sprints, the team had delivered 19 points or more of work and would be able to be successful 90% of the time, and that would be the kind of relationship that would build trust. Just think about just simple one-on-one exchanges you have within your organizations. When do you trust that someone's going to show up for a meeting on time? If they show up for the meeting 50% of the time and half the time they're there 5 minutes late, are you going to start readjusting your expectations about how you're going to react to them because they're always that little bit late? Or are they on time 90% of the time, and that one little bit is things happen, and we understand that. But I was thinking about this question in terms of rhythm. If we want to be able to have a rhythm in which we have a predictable set of outcomes, well, part of those predictions means that we have forecasts that are things that we can make have reasonable confidence in, and I think that comes back down to what is it that we are committing to within our organizations. Now that said, stuff happens, and when we come back to this question of rhythm, where we have content, tempo, and quality, if you have to miss something, my advice is that we should miss on content. The reason is that if we miss on tempo, we affect everyone that might have been counting upon the content that we had in that particular release. If we miss on quality, we have the potential to affect everyone that was counting on that particular work product. But if you miss on content, presuming that we haven't missed everything, then presumably we can minimize the impact on the other stakeholders that might have been counting on us. One of the things, though, that I was thinking about a little bit last night when we were listening to the monolith versus microarchitecture debate is that one of the things that rhythm does is get us to thinking about things in smaller batch sizes. If we think about historically about our software industry, we are much more likely to screw up and fail on our large projects, right? The bigger something is, the more likely things are going to go wrong, the more likely things are going to change between the time that we start and the time that we move forward. And one of the things that thinking about things in the context of rhythm does is thinking about what is it that can we do smaller and get it out and have value for, and in fact be more successful with. And so one of the things that rhythm, I think, has this other consequence of helping us achieve success, aside from everything else, is getting us to think into sort of smaller, more achievable portions of work that the other partners within our ecosystem can make use of. So one of the things that's happening in some parts of the software development community is that you're seeing a lot more emphasis on lean and Kanban and other kinds of models that are based upon the continuous development and delivery of work. And does this notion of rhythm still apply there? And as I thought about it, I think that it does, and as we'll explore here. So just for a bit of context, one of the things that the folks in that community like to talk about is this notion of having organizations that are focused on resource optimization versus those that are flow optimized. So for anyone who's driven around DC or the Beltway here in Baltimore, this notion that we have a fully optimized road is great, right? We have all the capacity of our road all filled up, and this is sort of what a fully utilized road looks like. But if you think about what this means for our organizations, it's when we try to think about, well, let's make sure everyone's busy. Let's make sure everyone has some work to do, and we end up with this kind of model. The problem, of course, with this model is that we don't have any kind of spare capacity to respond to any kind of disruption. Whereas if you think about our problem is not from the perspective of how do we make sure that everyone is being used, do we focus the problem on how do we make sure that we're actually getting stuff through the system, then we end up with something that looks like a flow optimized road. In which case our measure of success is not how full the road is, but on how quickly can we get from onto the road and off to our respective destination. So the book, this is Lean, Resolving the Efficiency Paradox, has a figure. This is a simplified figure of some of the discussion in that book. Talking about what this means for organizations is that if you can either be resource efficient and try to strive to be in this top left-hand quadrant, or you can be sort of flow efficient, but we can't be perfectly resource and flow efficient at the same time. So if you think about back to our road example, imagining the Beltway filled with cars bumper to bumper, all driving at 65 miles an hour, the slightest disruption would be catastrophic failure for the organization. But what this means for rhythm, though, is that if we are in this resource-optimized quadrant up on the top left, we don't have any spare capacity to respond to any kind of variance in our circumstances, whether it's unexpected technical things that are happening while we are in development, whether it's unexpected business changes that the organization needs to respond to. And so in order for us to be in a context in which we can have predictable outcomes, we need to be back closer into this, on the lower right-hand side where we have some degree of flow efficiency, so we have the capacity to make sure that we have a predictable outcome of work. So we end up with a picture something like this, whereas instead of thinking about our commitments in terms of velocity and yesterday's weather and the kind of thing that we would do in a time box kind of model, here we would have some kind of distribution of what our cycle time is for our work. And we can think about things in terms of means and medians, but what's that point at which we can say 90% of the time the work that flows into our organization we get done in that period of time or less, and that might then become the basis for which we can make predictions that we can achieve a reasonable rhythm within our organizations. Now, one of the important things about rhythms is that we also have rhythms for conferences, and my understanding is that the next thing we have is a break. So I got time for a question or two before we go on and have our snacks.
Questions? Where's our question guy over there?
I accept this that rhythm is important, and how do you foresee your concepts to feed into things like the mini quality attribute workshop or more traditional architecture design methods? What can we do to improve these assets so that we get more rhythm?
So I think there's an interesting question about what's the right kind of pacing, right? So one of the things I think you had made the comment that these big decisions happen. Don't happen, change all the time, right? So just because an organization may have some period of work where things are happening in sort of a quick flow, maybe there's some point at which the organization as a whole should say, okay, what's the right cadence for us to be reevaluating what our quality profile should be? Just because we've gone through and done this workshop today, is that still the right profile that we should have 6 months from now, right? Our competitors may have done something differently. Our customers have different needs that may reemerge. So what's the pace for having that? Let's say that you decide that you take the mini quality workshop for it as an example. what's the right pacing for that? Let's say that you decide, maybe we should be doing this annually, right? Well, after the second or third time that you go through this, the organization will sort of know, oh, I know what a mini QAW is. Let's go do that. And some of the kind of setup that you had to do this in the first place goes down because you don't have to have less explicit communication with people. They sort of have an understanding about what's going to happen. And then the cost of doing that can go down because that's sort of part of the rhythm of the organization. Whereas if every time that you do one of these things, it's a new thing, then that requires a lot more explicit communication to have that happen. So I think you can have, like I said in one of the early slides, you can have different kinds of rhythms within your organization, and it's not just all about driving it at what's the lowest level of what the development teams are doing.
I like your well-phrased statement, and I agree with it. If you have to miss on something, make it content. So if that's the case, do you call that technical debt?
It's probably not. I think the technical debt actually happens more when you take the shortcut on the quality step, right? So let's say so think about two scenarios, right? So one scenario, let's say you have 3 features and you don't think you can get all 3 done. Let's say you did all 3 features, but you skipped on the testing. To me, that would be where you're incurring technical debt. But if you had 2 features and you got them done, and you did all things you needed to do, you had 2 features done, but they didn't necessarily have any unnecessary technical debt. And you might have a feature backlog, and then that might drive other kinds of conversations around, well, if that feature is going to go to the next release, then maybe what gets pushed off the release. But I think that's more of a product prioritization as opposed to a technical debt response.
One last question?
You talked about dropping some of the features if you can meet the deadlines. That might also affect some of the stakeholders' confidence on the promise we made versus features we delivered. How do we handle that?
So the question was, if you drop a feature, that's going to affect stakeholder confidence. How do you handle that?
Right. So there are a couple things, right? So the first thing is that the reason why I think rhythm's important is that if that's the only thing you're going to be doing for that stakeholder in a 1 or 2 year period, then they don't have any confidence that there's not going to be another opportunity to get that for a long time out. That's a much different kind of conversation from, oh yeah, we've delivered stuff every quarter for the last 3 quarters, and we're going to have another one next quarter. That's a much different kind of experience with that stakeholder. And so if you're in a low trust environment and you haven't had a history of delivery, that's a really big problem, and it's going to take a lot of time to recover from that. If, however, you've built up a reputation for delivering on commitments with a regular pace, and you have this forecast of continuing to have a regular pace, then that's going to be a much less concerning response for them. So I think the fact is that we're not going to be perfect, right? If we make forecasts that we are going to hit all of the time, then we create this problem where we're sandbagging things, right? And we're not achieving and delivering as much as we could, right? And so I think you can't necessarily expect perfection, and you're going to miss things, and so you want to have it in an ecosystem where the things that do happen that are non-optimal aren't going to destroy the health of the overall ecosystem.
Okay, well, thanks again for your talk.